Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Disaster Recovery and Build Back Better. Today we are going to discuss about some of the summary of the discussions which happened in the GADRI, Global Alliance of Disaster Research Institutes, the fourth summit which just recently happened in Kyoto University in Japan. So I am one of the rapporteuring member of one of the group, Social Dimension of Risk, Health and DRM, which I will just briefly discuss about how different perceptions and have summarized this particular aspect, and also a little bit about GADRI. And in fact, Dr. Shubhajyoti will be already mentioning about the GADRI and its initiatives in one of the lecture. So I am going to discuss about the recent GADRI summit which just happened on from 13th to 15th of March, and where I was reporting this particular group on social dimension of risk and health and DRM. Here there are two topics. One is the social dimension of risk and also the health. And this was actually discussed in the fourth global summit, which is a group discussion of 1D on 13th March in DPRI, Disaster Prevention Research Institute in Kyoto University. On the chairs are Subhajyoti Samadar and Andrew Collins. Co-chairs are Yuichiro Ono, and for health, Virginia Murray, and rapporteurs myself, Ram Satish Possibility, and Robin U. Miller. In fact, when we talk about the GADRI, first of all, this has become a platform for all the academic institutes who are doing the research in disaster recovery and disaster related research. So it is a platform for all these institutes to come together and share the knowledge and inform the policy, practice, and also the theory. So in that way, this is one of the important platform the DPRI is taking an intense effort to bring all these researchers together, so that how we can advocate the DRR practices in a much better way. So in fact, the third Global Summit of Research Institutes of Disaster Risk Reduction, where we call it GSRIDRR, and this is where they talk about the expanding the platform for bridging science and policy making. And this was in similar time last year, 19th to 21st of March, where I was also part of this program, and I was also participated in a number of discussions there with various different stakeholders coming into the discussion, people from different backgrounds, and we did discuss on certain themes. And finally, we also present our findings to the community present over there and how to take it forward. Now, in the recent, the fourth summit, the Global Summit of Research Institutes for Disaster Risk Reduction, the theme is about the increasing the effectiveness and relevance of our institutes, how we can increase. And I was in one of the discussion where the social dimension of risk and health and DRM. So myself and Robin were part of the rapporteuring group, and we were actually presented in the panel discussions where Srikant and they have chairing this session. So the purpose and objectives of this session were to identify how research on social construction of risk can be used for effective DRR, to consider how the understanding of risk can be better circulated and discussed among stakeholders to reach a shared recognition of the social dimension of risk, to work out how the understanding risk can help to design the countermeasures of DRR, to reflect and report on future research directions relating to the social dimension of disaster risk. So we also got key questions that are to be addressed. To what extent are hazards, risks and disasters within society currently well known? How can the social construction of risk be effective for DRR? And how can an improved understanding of risk be communicated around varying DRR stakeholders? In what way does understanding of the social dimensions of the risk help drive DRR? So this was our main important questions, and after that the thorough discussions happened within each groups, and we are collecting different viewpoints from different stakeholders, and then we try to compile in this one simple diagram a conceptual understanding. Number one, context of risk. When we say context of risk, itself has a different meaning, especially the people living on the edge. Edge here, I am not responding that people living on the mountainous edge, but I am talking about the more vulnerable conditions who are prone to these disaster risk. Disaster is not just a natural context, but it is the social vulnerability, how it puts them into the risk, the how hazard makes them into a disaster, and that is where the H into V is equal to R. So disaster is a social construct because there has been an unequal distribution of resources, skills, abilities, because someone who is in South America and someone who is in Japan, if both of them are hit by the similar magnitude of earthquake, how they are prepared. So what kind of impact here, what kind of impact here. So that all tells about how each community has responded with their abilities to skills to face the the challenges given by the hazard. And this is the third point which I am going to discuss is more of, when we talk about the social dimension, it is more of a very philosophical aspect, how I is accountable for we and ours and yours. So when we talk about the risk, when we talk about the society, it starts with I, and it is I and how we relate to the we as a community, and how we relate to our as a larger group, and how we are relating to your, so how we can actually look a global community in a different perspective, how we are actually able to consider and contribute to the risk factor. The knowledge, when we talk about knowledge, how local knowledge understands risk, because the scientific knowledge understands in a different way, but how the local knowledge how perceives the risk, how they understand the risk. This is very important because the scientific community always undermines the local knowledge. They always believe that you are not, many of the cases when NGOs or anything, they always try to undermine what people already lived for many years. They said you are not in a good way, so let's impose our way of it. How the local knowledge systems reduces the vulnerability, how these local knowledges have been reducing the vulnerability and how one can tap this knowledge. Also, very less is known between the acceptable and unacceptable risks, because what is acceptable to me may not be acceptable to the other person who comes from a different cultural or a development background. So one has to really look into what is acceptable to whom, by what, from what, and what is an unacceptable risk. Maybe different cultures perceive that in a different way. And less is very documented and transferred. Introducing DRR as a culture at school education. So in order to bring the DRR into our society, it cannot just happen in only one day, but by introducing these concepts at a school level, this has been advocated by different experts, Rohit Jigyasu and even many other experts have pointed out that this has to bring at a disaster risk reduction at a school level education itself, so that children will understand the realization of how they can handle it, how they can prepare for it. And it also brings sensitivity among the kids. and improving the evidence-based knowledge. So we have to rely on the evidence-based. There is also one of the other dimension which we focused on, the legal framework, where there has been an implementation gaps and challenges. How there is policy, there are certain rules and regulations where we have a regulatory framework, but challenges in implementing and take it down at a local level is one of the biggest challenge. Also, the national and regional and local level regulatory frameworks, sometimes they contradict with each other, sometimes they have conflicting issues. There is a policy to practice, what policy advocates and what practice perceives it. There is always a gap. So this is of one aspect, but other aspects is when we talk about perceptions. First of all, perception of a risk itself is a very subjective, because it also defined from who is perceiving it, right? When we talk about risk to whom, risk to what, risk at when, okay, how it becomes a risk. So all these questions are very subjective in nature. It varies from community to community, nation to nation, and culture to culture. And where your position is. Are you from the, how the NGOs perceive the risk, how the scientific community perceives the risk, how the communities perceive the risk, how the local governments perceive the risk. So there are various challenges in addressing all these things as a perception. When we say the communication, first of all, there are gaps within the horizontal level of community, within the communities, also across the communities. Also, there has been a gaps in the how education thinks and how research thinks, and how the policy thinks, how the practice thinks. So there is a larger gap network which exists in this education, research, policy, and practice. When we say about coordination, there are the coordination between community and communities. There is a dialects of these aspects, community and communities, discipline and disciplines. Within the discipline, there is the coordination, lack of coordination, and across the disciplines is also lack of the coordination. And there are also coordination issues across different spatial scales, and also the manner of presentation, how it is presented, because how a communication for development is very important. When you make certain development scheme, how you present to the local communities, how they take it, how you bring that coordination within these community groups and the local governments. So this is all to do with the manner of presentation. Also, we all talk about the collaboration and cooperation. Collaboration also has to look at how the global community can collaborate with the local communities, and how they can cooperate with the national and the regional and local. So this how these various segments of these, whether it is a scientific community or a political community, how they can come with a hands-on situations so that they can cooperate with each other and work towards DRR. So that is where this whole schematic diagram puts participation and partnerships, how we can bring these partnerships with the global actors, global agencies to the local agencies, how we can build partnerships with the academic institutions, the research institutions, and the practice and policy level institutions. So this is where the putting people in a center, which actually emphasizes on self-reliability versus with the dependency. So the moment we are increasing the self-reliability with these participatory approaches, that improves the trust. It builds trust not only between the communities, it also empowers trust between the governments and the local governments and the agencies and the communities. So this is what the understanding which the thematic group has given. And we go to the next group where on the health aspect. First of all, what are the root causes of these, the factors that are associated with this health, especially in the disaster context? One is the direct and indirect risks, because what we know is a certain risk, but certain in the health aspect we may encounter some unknown risks. It might be an indirect risk, like for instance there is uncertainty of known and unknown risks. A new diseases will be born, Imagine there's a flood affected area in Kashmir. What happened was during the floods, people were migrated and they've taken a lot of measures in the relief operations. But after 2-3 weeks, once the whole water get drained up, then the new set of diseases came when, because of the epidemic and endemic diseases spread out when the water drained up. So that is where, and it's a kind of uncertainty, when it will come and how it will come and what kind of diseases it will come. So this is one thing one has to look at. Also, there is a disciplinary orientation gaps in undertaking risk, in understanding risks related to health and DRR. So there's a pharmaceutical understanding is different, there's a health understanding, there's a biological understanding is different. So different disciplines don't correlate with each other. That is one important aspect of how they actually orient themselves in understanding the risk and how they don't collaborate with each other. Even here, we notice that there's an unequal resource allocation and access to medical infrastructure, especially the marginalized communities are mostly prone areas are the poor rural communities or the poverty communities. How these people have an unequal resource allocation. They might be having a less medical infrastructure compared to they have a less infrastructure, medical facilities or the professional expertise compared to the people who are living in urban areas. So this is also one of the challenge, how one can take these infrastructure facilities to the most affected. Then the farmers' risk management, especially in the event of droughts, even the event of floods, how the farmers also manage the risk, that will also have a contribution to the health aspect. Also the market driven risk, because the market also emphasizes on consumption of certain drugs or they pushes certain business sectors into it. So there are also some risk associated with the market related things. The lack of framework to compare cases and essential knowledge series. So one has to see that there is not sufficient frameworks how we can compare different cases and the knowledge in order to see a holistic understanding. And now another aspect is the antibiotization and pesticidation, because in the health sector, even you go for a small fever, you get antibiotics, especially in developing countries. And this is one thing which is actually creating an impact on the abilities, how the natural abilities to cope up the immunities, it is affecting the immunity of an individual and collectively as a group as well. So also the pesticidization, like usage of heavy pesticides in our foods, how it is actually going back to our cells, basic cells, and how it is creating a different effects on our genetics. That is also the long run impacts. The quality and legal enforcement of drugs, how one can ensure the the quality and the legal aspect of what kind of drugs. For instance, recently there was an issues with certain pharmaceutical companies on even the polio drops. So one who can ensure it. Lack of basic hygiene conditions. So one is first of all in the infrastructure itself, how we lack the basic hygiene conditions. So that is how health and safety is an integral part of the DRR. That's how these all set of things contribute that health and safety itself, because the upper limit of health we cannot define, but the lower limit of health is at least we are alive. That's the lower limit of being safe. That's where the DRR context we need to see that we have to push to the upper point, and one need to look from the community perspective, look from the market perspective. And this is how we can go ahead with it, the time dimension of health in DRR. So it is not only the pre-disaster, during disaster, the health dimension can abruptly change even after 3 weeks, some unknown risks, some direct risks. So there is a time dimension of health in DRR. Another aspect is the accessible. Whether the medical infrastructure or the personnel are accessible to you or not. In the event of crisis, can someone access these infrastructure and services? The third aspect is accountable. When we say accountable, whether we are making sure that this quality and legal frameworks are making sure that it is reaching to the common man. How the allocations are being accountable, affordable. how it can be, because in a developing countries, only with the privatization aspect, whether the common man can afford, the poor man can afford these things. And advocacy of right practices, how one can actually address the right practices, what to do and what not to do. This is where we need build partnerships with various local and global agencies and national level agencies, how we have to advocate these right practices, how we can bring these things to the marginalized communities. So this is a partnership and coordination is very much needed in the health sector as well. So these are some of the findings, which was a part of the discussions on the social dimension of risk and health and DRM. So I just try to present it as a discussion, and I think this will give you an eye opening for a variety of issues which are involved in the disaster risk management. Thank you very much.